Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. I appreciate your patience. We started a couple minutes late just to let everybody who's planning to get on be able to attend this webinar, as I know sometimes it can be a little tricky to log in. So again, thank you for taking the time out of your day to listen to us. Today is the first part of a three-part webinar series that we're doing here at Equilar, where we're looking at the rest of 2013. We're looking ahead to discuss the hot topics that we think everyone will be dealing with over the next year. These webinars are based off of our Compensation and Governance Outlook report, which we released late last year in December. If you'd like a copy of that report, as well as a copy of the slide deck, you can find that in the resource list on the webinar today. You can also contact your account manager at Equilar, and we'll be able to get you that information as well. Again, a copy of the slides from today's webinar will be available in the resource list. I'm pleased to welcome Wendy Davis, a partner at Cooley, who will be leading us with her expert insights today as we talk about executive pay in the say-on-pay era.
Thanks, Aaron.
As I mentioned, today is the first part of our three-part webinar series, and so in 2 weeks we'll be talking about corporate governance with Abe Friedman, a managing partner at Camberview, and Lydia Beebe, the corporate secretary and chief governance officer at Chevron. In a month we'll be talking about the evolving board pay and structure on the 27th of February with Ted Dysert from Hydro Struggles and Lynn Joy from Exequity. Both of those webinars promise to have some great insights from those people as they are the top experts in their field, and we're certainly honored to have them as much as we are to have Wendy Davis on today's webinar. So that's the schedule for the upcoming webinar. Let's jump into today's agenda. So today we'll be discussing three primary topics. Of course, there's a lot that we could talk about when it comes to executive compensation, but we only have an hour, so we're going to focus on three of the big ones. First, we'll discuss pay for performance and the role it's playing in shaping proxies. Then next, we'll discuss the importance of internal pay equity and its impending or not impending impact on companies. And then finally, we'll discuss peer groups, which really came to the forefront as a hot topic last year, or the last several years, really. And of course, at the end, we'll have time for Q&A. There will also be a poll that we'll ask you to fill out before you leave, so if you could please make sure to fill that out at the end, we would much appreciate that. Again, if you have questions throughout the webinar, we'll designate time at the end to answer them. Potentially, we might be able to get them in the midst of the webinar, but feel free to submit that throughout the webinar, and then at the end we'll try and answer as many as we can depending on how much time we have left. And so on that note, let's dive into our first topic. Pay for performance is probably the most popular buzzword when it comes to executive compensation. Everybody's talking about the need for it. Say and pay votes are determined by it, but really no one can agree on how to exactly define it. So let's break down this idea and discuss the effect that it's having on companies. When you're talking about pay for performance, there's really three questions that need to be answered, and they're very basic. One is, how do you calculate pay? In other words, what is pay? What truly constitutes as pay? What is considered performance? And then how does that performance affect the pay? In other words, there's really no concrete definition for any three of these, as different organizations and different institutions are using different definitions for a lot of these. And if a company and investor agree on one aspect, that doesn't necessarily mean that they agree on the other. Again, the definitions can change from company to investor to even the proxy advisors to even the media without a consensus being reached by any of them. As companies wrestle with these issues on how to ensure that those evaluating the company, whether they're investors or proxy advisors, do so with an understanding of the company's viewpoint, they have turned to a number of ways to make sure that their point is being gotten across by those who are reading the proxies. One way we've seen this is through the use of visual representation of pay for performance. Talking and writing about pay for performance are nice, but to really get that point, a number of companies are moving more towards visuals to help make their point. The two images on the screen represent graphs that can be found in Equilar's pay for performance tool. The image on the left is very similar to what you can find in a number of proxies, essentially a matrix using performance on the y-axis and pay on the other. And again, this allows a company to show where they rank relative to their peers using both categories. And so it's easy to identify, and in this case you've got the red or orangish section in the bottom right that implies that pay is really high while performance is quite low. And again, it allows for something an investor reading a proxy to look at this graph and to quickly pick up whether or not there is pay for performance alignment. The second chart on the right is how a company might be scored in pay for performance test by Glass Lewis using an A through F model. Again, this is being shown as an outlier, and you can essentially indicate a potential issue for a company when it comes to passing their say on pay. For those who fall in the D and F region, they're probably on higher alert for potential say on pay vote battle than those who have an A. Certainly it doesn't mean that you're going to fail if you have a low grade or that you're going to pass if you have a high grade, but it certainly can indicate issues that you'd want to know about before the vote.
Aaron, can we take a step back for a second just to pay for performance? And as you noted, companies may have different opinions of pay for performance from investors, from investor advisor entities like ISS or Glass Lewis. And in the rush to show pay for performance, I think companies sometimes say, oh, I just need a graph, or I just need to have certain boxes that I can check, and then I'll be able to show pay for performance. And I think even now, a number of years into the pay for performance awareness trend, shall we call it, it's always good for companies at the start of the year to just stop, perhaps forget everything they've done in the past, and just take a fresh look at what does performance mean for us? What is our business model? What is the value proposition for our company? What does performance mean for us? Because Cooley's very fortunate to work with a number of life science companies and biotechnology companies who are still in the clinical stage. And so performance for them isn't necessarily stock price increase. Performance for them is reaching a new clinical milestone, getting FDA approval. And so in the rush to claim pay for performance or to have a graph that shows how your stock price has risen, as compared to pay, I think it's important to stop and think, what is the real business's pay for performance model? But also then keep in mind that notwithstanding that that's how the board and management look at pay for performance, it is important to know that that may not be how investors, ISS, Glass Lewis judge them. And I think that's when having a visual representation of pay for performance, it's important to be able to tell both of those stories if they're not the same.
Yeah, thanks, Wendy, and that's a great point. I think not to gloss over that fact, but having a chart in your proxy does not replace the need to be able to explain what the chart is and what the company views as performance and how they did and what the company views as pay. I think we've certainly seen an increase in the use of charts to help aid that discussion, but it doesn't take that place. It doesn't gloss over the fact that you still need to effectively communicate to your shareholders what it is how you view pay, how you view performance, and again, how those two intersect.
And I think the other thing to say about that is a lot of companies will say, well, I just need a chart, and Pfizer or whomever is best of breed, so let's just take their chart. It's important to remember that once you start using charts, your investors might expect them to continue from year to year. And it's important to be comfortable that even though the chart may look really impressive this year because the results were impressive, there may come a year where you're not pleased with what that chart shows. So I think it's important for boards and management to have a firm commitment that if charts are the way to go, and if it's best not to keep changing up the chart formation each year or to have charts some year and not others. I think it's important to commit.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. And building off of that, obviously, I talked about the inclusion of more charts. Obviously, the discussion around pay for performance has become more prevalent. It's become more detailed. There's more disclosure in proxies. And if we look at our next slide, and we look at the word count for CDNAs, we can see that just the word count that among the largest companies, this is a study of the Fortune 100, has grown significantly, especially over the last several years, as, of course, there's been new regulations requiring more disclosure around things like risk, stuff around metrics, talking about peer groups and consultants, but also just companies trying to explain their story more. Again, as Say on Pay has been implemented a couple years ago, where it's now mandatory for companies, the need to be able to explain their story has come in, and so they're spending more words, they're spending more paper to make sure that their point is being given to their investors. Part of the reason that we've seen that number go up is the use of executive summaries in the CDNA portion of the proxy. Again, you can see a pretty dramatic jump from 2010 to 2011. Again, 2011 being the year that Say on Pay first became mandatory, of companies putting a section in their CDNA, typically at the very beginning, giving a quick summation about how they view performance and how they did, giving the investor context around what they're about to read with regard to pay and how the company views that. And so that's become a majority tool that people are using and putting in their CDNAs, almost 70% in 2012, and I think we're going to see that go up in 2013. Again, to put into context to the performance, hopefully to explain in a little bit plainer language so that the people reading it will have a better understanding of exactly how the company did during that year.
I think a well-crafted executive summary that shows the 5 to 10 points that you want investors to take away in one sentence per point can be exceedingly helpful because looking at a 12 or 20-page CDNA is daunting. And giving that reader a one-page, at most, summary with bullets that highlight the 5 to 10 points you most want to make can be very powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I think Wendy hit on the point of being able to clearly and succinctly explain what the company's position is and what they're trying to communicate, instead of just adding language for language's sake. Another reason that CDNAs have gotten longer is more and more companies are using alternative pay calculations and explaining pay in their own terms. Again, talking about the graph earlier and people wanting to show the connection between pay for performance, most companies don't don't look at pay in the context of the summary compensation table. Certainly the salary and cash bonus payouts are something that they'll use, and they're aware of the grant date value, but a lot of companies will look at pay in a different context, or will have a slightly different calculation than how they have to disclose it in the summary compensation table that's mandated by the SEC. And so again, in trying to ensure that their story is being told the way they want it to be told so that investors are able to see it from their vantage point, you're seeing more and more companies using and discussing alternative pay calculations to the SEC table. And again, over the last couple of years, we've definitely seen an increase there. as it's gone up to over 40% of companies. And again, this is among the Fortune 100, where it's more likely that they're going to discuss something like that than maybe some of the smaller companies. But again, that's just another point reemphasizing that companies are trying to, in the explanation of pay for performance, trying to make sure that the definition of performance and the definition of pay are being put on their terms and are at least being expressed to investors, as opposed to relying on the regulations and what they're required to file to tell their story in the right way.
And again, I think it's really critical that if you're going to use an alternate definition of pay or how you look at pay, it really should be how the comp committee looks at pay. It's not, as you noted, one size fits all, and it should be consistent with the rest of your explanation of how you made pay decisions. And again, you need to commit. It would not be in your best interest to have a definition of pay that changes from year to year, absent being an underlying change in your policy of how you determine pay.
Yeah, that's a great point. And if we look at a couple of examples here of different pay calculations, I think there are two very popular methods for calculating pay other than the summary compensation, using the summary compensation table numbers, specifically using the grant date value of equity. One of which is realizable pay, which is a method that Equilar uses in its pay for performance model. And again, you can see a company like Coach has uses it, and they also have a nice little graph there explaining how their 3-year TSR, which they feel is a good measure, aligns with their realizable long-term incentive compensation. Again, trying to explain their story in a way that is effective, and that they feel that realizable pay is something that captures exactly how they view pay, how the compensation committee views pay, and again allows them to tell their story in an effective manner. The other popular method is the realized pay example, which for realizable pay, and again the terminology can get a little confusing, but realizable pay essentially takes the actual value of equity awards, not using Black-Scholes, but how much value has actually been gained, how much an option is actually worth at the end of a year. So if the stock price goes up, how much does that affect an option? How much does that affect a stock award? Realized pay it's much more similar to the idea of a take-home pay, what would show up in a person's taxes at the end of the year, where it looks at the vesting of stock awards and then the exercise of options. Now, of course, there's issues with both, and for realized, it certainly can be you can potentially have much more sporadic numbers, where if a CEO or an executive holds on to their equity for many years and then decides to cash it all in at once, it'll look like a huge pay spike in one year, whereas the other years that individual will have a lower number. But it is something that, from a take-home standpoint, what the person actually could have cashed in, that it's another popular way of calculating pay. And you can see ExxonMobil is a company that uses that, and showcasing that the difference between the realized pay and then what is being reported in the SEC table, you see those numbers for all of them are at a minimum of $10 million. And in fact shows that their pay is being overstated by the summary compensation table, at least is how they look at it. So things to look at, and again, as Wendy mentioned, it's something that you need to look at and commit to. You don't want to jump back and forth and say, this year we're going to use realizable pay because it makes me look good, and next year we'll use grant date pay, and the year after that we'll use realized pay, just looking at the numbers. Again, I think investors are looking for consistency. And Wendy, to bring you back in, and I know you already touched on some of this, but how should we look at pay for performance? Because it seems like there's a lot of people trying to figure that out and using different methodologies and looking for both pay and performance. What is your recommendation? What do you see as far as a good way to look at measuring pay for performance?
Sure. I always think it's important that the company start, or the comp committee start, with a good independent comp consultant and not underestimate the value that a well-seasoned comp consultant can provide, both in providing accurate, up-to-date data and also creating a peer group that is appropriate. I know we'll talk about that in a little bit. I think, again, it's important that the company look at its business plan for the year, understand what it's trying to incentivize that year and perhaps for the next 2 to 3 years, and create a program that aims towards that. And I do truly believe in the business judgment role. I truly believe that directors know their companies best, and that simply looking at TSR, well, it can be helpful, especially over a long term. On a year-to-year basis, I don't necessarily think that that's the truest sense of performance, especially for, as I said, Cooley is very fortunate to work with life science companies, and they could work a number of years before the stock price really moves. And then when it moves, it moves. And so you have to be in it for the long term. But I do think it's very important that the comp committee and the board not operate in a vacuum. They do live in a world with say on pay. They do live in a world where ISS and Equilar and Fidelity and others have to make decisions, and they try to make those decisions in as efficient and accurate a way as they can. And the way they do that is, as you noted, to look at, among other things, TSR. And so I think that a comp committee is best advised to look not only at how they wish to measure pay for performance, but to keep in mind how the market views their performance. And they can stick to their guns. I don't think that an ISS recommendation or a Glass-Lewis analysis changes the business judgment rule, but I do think that it would be a disservice to shareholders not to keep in mind what that recommendation is likely to look at and have a heart-to-heart with themselves and with management about whether there are other adjustments that they should be making in their pay philosophy or their pay practices to address concerns that are perhaps rightfully raised by ISS or Glass-Lewis or Fidelity, or be that as it may.
So when we're talking about disclosure, and obviously being at Equilar, I love disclosure, and
obviously as a writer of CDNAs, I love disclosure too.
Yeah, it's interesting. We love to see the outliers and the unique practices, and I've been talking a bit about the use of charts and alternative pay calculations and things like that. Ultimately, do they matter? I mean, do they really move the needle, or are they just window dressing? Is it something that really the focus should be on making sure that the message gets out there as opposed to whether or not the charts look pretty, or is it important to make sure that you have pretty charts and making sure that you have tables and things like that showcasing your numbers?
I think if you are relying on charts alone to tell your story, that you're missing the whole point of the game. Or the whole point of say on pay. Investors want communication, and I think that's a reasonable expectation. And your job is to communicate with them, not just at say on pay time, but throughout the year. And that is the time to be explaining how you view pay on performance, so you can get their feedback and make better decisions. And so I do think that if you firmly believe in realizable or realized pay as how you make compensation decisions, it's essential to be having those discussions with your investors and with the market throughout the year. And in that case, yes, I have seen those charts move the needle, but it's not the charts, it's the underlying communication that carries that is part of that the charts are part of. I think if all you're counting on is that you you're going to get a bad ISS recommendation and you throw a chart in there saying that you have a different way of looking at the world, I wouldn't expect that that's going to move the needle.
Yeah, and so thanks for the insights on that. I'd love to keep talking about this, but I think we need to move on so we have time to talk about the other issues, and one of which is internal pay equity, which is another issue that has grown in importance, partly because of the presence of Dodd-Frank and the CEO pay ratio rule, which we'll talk about in just a second, in the Dodd-Frank bill, but the concern over making sure that pay is equitable and fair, not just across companies, that a CEO is getting paid for performance and relative to their peers, but also inside the company, is something that I think people are certainly taking a look at and are caring a great deal about, and we're seeing more and more discussion around that. Equilar did a study last year where we looked at the median pay of the different levels of NEOs at companies, so looking at the CEO and then the number 2 highest paid, 3, 4, and 5. And we saw that for the S&P 500, clearly the pay amount is a bit higher, and you can see that it being a little bit over 2.5 or about 2.5 of a ratio between number 1 and number 2 is something that's about where the median level is. And obviously this depends on industry and the type of CEO and some circumstances around there. But that's something that I think is receiving a lot of attention, where people are starting to look internally at how their pay measures up relative to the other NEOs, at least with regards to their CEO. If you look at the pay ratios between the S&P 500 large cap, you've got the 400 mid cap, and then the 600 small cap, you can see typically it's about a ratio of about 2 to 1 for the CEO relative to the second highest paid NEO. For the large cap, it's a little bit more, again, as those CEOs are the highest paid by far. And so that's what we're seeing to date as far as the numbers look like, and what we're seeing just among the top executives. We are seeing some disclosure around internal pay and how companies are looking at it, how they're viewing it. Spartan Stores talks about using a ratio range between 3 to 3.5 between their CEO and other named executive officers. Again, not wanting to get the ratio too out of whack where the CEO is making that much more than the other NEOs. And then Whole Foods, which has been doing this for many years, sets an actual limit on the amount of cash that they pay their CEO and their top executives through the use of a multiple of the company's average annual wage. So there's someone who actually benchmarks their pay internally relative to the rest of their employees, so the people who are working at their store, as opposed to just the other top executives.
And I think that's a really good point, because it's funny. I watch SEC comment letters in response to CD&A disclosures. I do a survey every year to see what the most common comments are. And I was surprised a couple years ago that a number of companies were receiving comments saying, explain what internal pay equity is. And I thought, well, isn't that self-obvious? And then I look at that table that you showed about large cap versus mid cap, and that first one of the CEO making almost $10 million and the number 5 person making just over $2 million, and I realized that it really can mean different things at different companies, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. I have a number of technology companies I work with who started as a small startup, venture capital, and they've always kept a teamwork perspective, that it's important that the CEO is getting treated just the same as the rest of the management team, if not the employees. And certainly Whole Foods is a great example of that culture where we're all in this together, or at least reporting that we're all in this together. And it doesn't surprise me now that the smaller cap companies have a ratio where it's more compressed. But I do think it's important that in your disclosures you don't just say we believe in internal pay equity, but that you explain what that means to your company and why. And for some companies, the answer is, look, our CEO is the guy with the vision, and he founded this company, and he takes the risks, and if something goes wrong, it's his fault, and therefore he should be paid more. And I have other companies who say our internal pay equity is that really it should be within 1.5 of the rest of the team, because they're all in it together, and they want to not create different incentives. So defining internal pay equity actually is very important. Also will help you dodge that comment from the SEC.
Yeah, depending on your priorities. But I think, which brings up the issue of, I mean, how important really is internal pay equity within the ecosystem of a company? I mean, disregarding the fact that you may want to be able to avoid any comment letter from the SEC, just among executives, how important is it to have internal pay equity?
I think if you don't expect that management and the employees are looking at that proxy when it comes out to see what that table says, you're kidding yourself. I really do think that it's important for the comp committee to understand, to make a decision on what internal pay equity means, how best to motivate their team, and communicate it. Because I do know that executives care how they're being treated as compared to the guy sitting in the corner office next to them. And certainly when you're looking to hire in a new member of management, when I'm negotiating executive agreements on behalf of the company with that person, I will regularly hear, but this guy at the company already has that. Why can't I have that double trigger protection or an award that's as big as this fellow's? And there may be good reasons why he shouldn't get that, but they're going to look, and they do want to be treated equally.
Yeah, so in other words, everybody's fine with their paycheck until they find out what other people are making.
Don't underestimate their morale impact.
Yeah, that's something that I've heard from other people as well, is the internal pay equity as an issue. There's a couple things that need to be considered and why it's important, other than just trying to have a culture of equity and equality, but having a measure of, one, keeping everybody happy and keeping things within perspective, and two, and also from a succession planning standpoint of if CEO pay gets too high and then you're trying to promote an internal CEO or you're trying to bring in somebody from the outside, it does set precedents. It can lead to defections among the top executives if they find out that they're not getting paid nearly as much as maybe the CEO, but they feel like they're doing just as much work or are as valuable, although obviously in a lesser role. So there's a number of things that certainly a company will want to think about when it comes to internal pay equity. And Wendy, the comment you made about making sure that you explain it and not just throw that buzzword out there in your proxy is, I think, noteworthy, because that, again, it's something that when you disclose something, you want to make sure that you do so in a thoughtful manner and do so clearly, as opposed to just checking a box to say that you talked about it or that you mentioned something.
Exactly.
So I promised we'd talk about it. I know it's kind of an interesting aspect to the whole internal pay equity, but in the Dodd-Frank bill there was a provision that talked about having the CEO's pay set to the median. I believe the terminology was the median of the annual total compensation of all employees for the company, and this has been a very controversial provision in the Dodd-Frank bill that most companies are.
This dates back to the new disclosure rules in 2006, when a version of this, which we all called the Katie Couric rule, came out. So this isn't just the Dodd-Frank Act, but it's another attempt at it.
Sure, and it's been something that people have been, a certain segment of the population certainly has been clamoring for a while, as you mentioned, Wendy. And so this provision was in the bill, is passed, but it has not yet been mandated, and we haven't seen it show up in proxies yet because the SEC has yet to offer definitive regulations on it. Wendy, can you maybe give us an update onto maybe why we haven't seen this show up in proxies yet?
Sure. So Dodd-Frank was required about 400 sets of regulations. Currently, they have achieved about 140 of those. And if I'm a betting woman, I'm going to say that they're hoping that this is the last one that they tackle so that it'll go away before they have to tackle it. This is incomprehensible how you will calculate this. And to junior budding engineers out there, the person who figures out the software on how to calculate summary compensation, total compensation for every single employee in every country with all the various different kinds of foreign legal compensation that's required. God bless you, because you're going to be a bazillionaire. This is just unwieldy, understates it. And I'm not really, I still don't understand how it's useful. I appreciate the sentiment that Whole Foods provides by talking about the ratio of the CEO's pay as they define it against the way that the checkout clerks are paid. But at the end of the day, this feels like, forgive me, compensation porn. I just don't see how this is important to boards when they're exercising their business judgment that is vested in them under Delaware or other state corporate law. This seems like the least important piece of information you could possibly put in front of them. Not to mention the number of hours and corporate resources that would have to go into calculating this. It just can't be worth the effort.
Yeah, and as Wendy mentioned, it's still there were so many provisions of the Dodd-Frank bill, and there's so many things that are on the SEC's plate that they have to go through, that this really hasn't been. This is one of those that was supposed to come out a couple years ago when it passed, and the SEC really hasn't even touched it and even gotten close to it. And there's still a number of provisions, including clawbacks and hedging and a bunch of other stuff that the SEC has yet to rule on, that are probably a higher priority, at least in their minds. Although we'll see what the new, how the new head of the SEC deals with this stuff, just to get through. And so there's yet to be. I haven't seen, and Wendy, I don't think you've seen any sort of a timeline on when they think they'll get through this Dodd-Frank stuff. I think they'll get through it when they get through it.
My guess is this is probably number 239 on their list.
Sure. So whenever they get to 239, I think that's when we'll see this issue dealt with. But for now, it's essentially shelved. I know, speaking from anecdotally, I get calls from the media all the time asking about this number and do they have it, because I think the media wants the number and finds it inherently interesting. I know the AFL-CIO comes out with a number every year looking at median CEO pay and compares that to the average worker's wage, and that number always causes some stir there. But again, from a company-by-company basis, companies don't really want to do it because of the amount of time and resources it would take to put that done. And from the investor side, although I'm sure there are some that are interested in seeing it, this is not the biggest priority for them compared to some of the other things. So, again, this is one of those, it might be a moot point. It's not something we'll need to worry about in the next couple of years, but always interesting to keep an eye on. And again, as companies are looking at internal pay equity, they might not look at it from a CEO to median pay for their workers numbers, but at least looking at it from their top executive standpoint, I think is going to be an issue that they'll continue to want to address and discuss as they try and figure out what's the appropriate balance there inside the firm, as well as benchmarking pay outside of the firm. So that leads us to our last topic, and I just talked about it when we were talking about benchmarking. The key to benchmarking is, of course, who are you benchmarking against? And so who is your peer group? And this really has become a very hot topic over the last couple years, thanks in large part to Say on Pay, as companies are disclosing who their peers are more frequently now than obviously 5-10 years ago. And it's also become a much bigger deal because whenever you're setting pay, who you use to benchmark can fundamentally change whether or not it looks like, whether or not the analysis says that you are performing and paying well compared to your peers or not, just depending on, again, who you may or may not include. When you're developing peer groups, it's been described as more of an art than a science, which I think is appropriate because there is no correct peer and there's no wrong peer per se. I think there's some obviously that would be called into question who you have, but there isn't that list where you can just put together a formula. And for a company, companies spend many hours and a lot of resources trying to develop these peer groups to do the best that they can and using their best judgment to construct it. Meanwhile, you've got proxy advisory firms who have to create an independent third-party peer group, and historically they've used a formula base to calculate that. And again, because of Say on Pay, a lot of companies were becoming more vocal about how they were being evaluated, and part of that evaluation that they disagreed with was who they were being benchmarked to. And so there's been a number of cases and a number of examples where companies have come out publicly and said that the peer group that was being used to evaluate them was off and was putting them in a negative light, where if their peer group that they had developed put them in a positive light. And because of that, we've seen just in the last year, the proxy advisors make some changes to how they develop their peer groups. One of probably the most notable, and this is of course self-serving, but Glass Lewis partnered with our firm Equilar and to use Equilar's market peers, where it is based off of, it starts fundamentally off of the company's disclosed peers and then uses an algorithm to determine a set of about 15 peers for that company. Again, the need to have an independent third-party peer group is important for the proxy advisors and for investors to fairly evaluate these companies. But again, utilizing the strength and the time that companies are putting into developing their own peer group is something that Glass Lewis recognized was important, and that the holes in just using a straight formula of 1/2 to 2x revenue and some sort of industry code didn't necessarily create a peer group, effective enough peer groups that help them with their pay for performance analysis. So they made their adjustment. We've seen ISS make adjustments to how they're calculating it. Again, essentially everybody is looking and reevaluating how peer groups are being developed, and do they really have the best peer groups in place? Are there companies that are missing? Are there ones that should be taken out? And so this is a topic that certainly people are taking very seriously. If we look at how companies are developing it, looking at disclosure in the proxies and what criteria is being used, you can see, again, industry and revenue are by far the two most popular metrics used, and market cap being the third. So really industry and size are the two metrics that most companies use. And they are using... And
I think those are used as a gate, right? I think that companies look first at those sorts of things, generate a large list, and then I think the companies that I've been working with at least, then really do move into those other points that you note on your slide as a gut check. Does this company really belong in our peer group, or is someone missing?
Right. Essentially what they're doing is they're narrowing the pool, because there's thousands of public companies, and certainly some companies will use an index approach, but a number will start with companies in their industry and in their size, and then from there they will pick them off and decide, this company doesn't fit for this reason. And you can see that there's a number of other criteria that companies use, from geography to competitors to even business model, or essentially the complexity of the business that a company may want to factor in when they're deciding who they want to benchmark to, because those things can also be important in terms of determining what's the appropriate pay. So most companies, looking at the number of metrics they use to at least help establish a baseline of their peer groups, use typically over two metrics. So again, this isn't a situation where they're using just one or two. They're using multiple to make sure that that their peer group covers everything and all the issues that they care about, and allows them to pick what they feel is the best peer groups. And there's really no right or wrong company. It's a question of, should you have 14 or 15 peers, and how big or small a company can you include? Can it be more than 2x? Is it 2.1x okay, or is 3x too big? And so again, it depends on the company and the industry and who they're competing with, and who they're benchmarking to. That will essentially the company will spend a lot of time to determine who the best peers are. As I mentioned.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Wendy.
What I actually see is that and companies are becoming so very thoughtful on this, and what I'm seeing, which frankly adds some complexity, is that they'll look at a peer group based on how revenue, industry, market cap, and even how ISS or Equilar Glass Lewis would propose the peer group, and then they have a separate peer group that they use as a touchstone. Either because that's where they likely have to compete for talent, or it's what they call aspirational, where they see the company going in 5 years, it would be on par with these other companies. And again, I don't think that's a bad thing. It does add complexity to the disclosure in the CD&A, but it could be very helpful.
Yeah, thanks for pointing that out, Wendy. Again, I think the main takeaway on this is that the complexity of peer groups is a lot greater than I think a lot of novices believe, and again, there's just a lot of time and effort spent in trying to craft these, and they look at the companies individually and try to make sure that they fit instead of just taking a broad swath and using an algorithm, and there it goes. That said, I talked about Glass Lewis's shift towards Equilar market peers, and for those who aren't familiar with it, and I'm not going to go into a long explanation, but essentially what it does is it starts with the company's disclosed peers and factors in the companies that the peers are benchmarking to, and then it also includes those who are benchmarking into that company. So it uses the web of connections to start the fundamental development of the peer group, and looking at Equilar market peers versus the company disclosed peers and how much overlap there is. In a study that we did of about 2,400 companies, about 80% of the companies have at least 50% of their peer group overlap with the Equilar constructed peers, and the average and median fit are about 66-67%. Again, the reason this is important is for companies that are concerned about how much a third-party peer group is differing from what they're doing and how much effect that can have. Using Equilar's peers, you can see that about 2/3 of the companies will probably match, and so there will be at least a high degree of similarity in terms of performance, but again, it won't include everything, and depending on how the company does, because if a company is benchmarking outside of their depth and doing something where they're benchmarking the companies much bigger that don't really benchmark to them, the Equilar market peers will probably be more different than a company, than a group of companies that all benchmark to each other and are very similar, and they're more likely to have a much higher, greater similarity in their peer group as according to Equilar market peers. And again, this is important because as the proxy advisors are making their recommendations for pay for performance, this is what they're using in terms of trying to figure out whether or not there's good pay for performance alignment.
And I think that's so important that the companies are still using their business judgment when deciding their peers, but I think being able to gut check it against who the other companies are that benchmark against them, as you said, through the Equilar peer model, is a really good gut check. And you don't want to end up on the front page of the Wall Street Journal because your peer group is so skewed. I will never forget the front page article about Tootsie Roll benchmarking against Kraft, whose revenue was 85 times higher. And I think that knowing who's benchmarking against you and looking at the overlap can avoid unfortunate surprises and bad press. No one wants to be on the front page of the Wall Street Journal like that.
Right. That's something I think most companies agree on. They don't want to show up on the front of the Wall Street Journal unless there's a title that says something like "Greatest Company Ever." But rarely do I think the Wall Street Journal run that headline. So again, it's something that as people want to be, as they're constructing their peer groups, as they're looking at their pay for performance, being aware of not just, well, here's what we think is best, but also being aware of how others are going to view you, specifically the proxy advisors. Because when it comes to say on pay, saying that, hey, we felt like we did a good job, if you're aware of what both ISS and Glass Lewis are doing ahead of time, you'll better be able to understand and craft an argument explaining either why they're wrong or at least be aware of that. And if there's changes, whether either to your disclosure or to your approach that you feel like would be relevant and helpful, that can be made ahead of time as opposed to after the fact, where you're filing an amended proxy to argue against something.
I think this is really the year to go back and reevaluate your disclosure about benchmarking and peer companies. The latest wave of securities litigation that we are seeing focuses on the adequacy of the disclosure in the proxy, as whether or not it provides all the material information for a stockholder to be able to make an informed say on pay vote or an informed vote on stock plans. I've been working very closely with my partner, Jessica Valenzuela Santa Maria, on this, and the number one or one of the 3 or 4 points that are made in the demand letters that we've seen and pulled off of filing services are wanting to know who was in the peer group and wanting to know how they got in there. So this is just a great chance to reset. And if you do have an aspirational company in your peer group that is going to look odd under the Equilar model or under the ISS model, use the CD&A to explain, hey, we include Apple in our peer group even though we're quite a bit smaller, but here's why. And it's because the last 5 engineers we've brought over have been from Apple or something. Obviously you don't want to suggest corporate rating, but you get what I'm saying. Like, this is the time to be thoughtful in your disclosure and head off concerns that you've stacked the deck for the benefit of your executives.
Yeah, exactly. Again, the more disclosure around that, the better. I skipped over a slide that I'll go back to really quickly, but there's a couple of examples of companies that at the end of last year went through their peer group and they dropped 3 companies. Lancaster dropped 3 companies and they added 4. And again, they explained why they did so and where they got them from. And Symmetricom again explained their process and that they annually used it and how they removed it. They looked at their list on an annual basis and they removed the companies that didn't fit that criteria anymore. And again, that goes back to speak that we're seeing even companies looking at their peer groups on a more frequent basis, on an annual basis, as opposed to revisiting it every couple of years. So certainly companies are taking the matter of peer groups more seriously. And I think we're almost out of time, so I want to get to a couple questions. One of which was regarding the Equilar peers, and another talking about my comments on realizable and realized pay. As far as the Equilar market peers, it's certainly need more time than the last 5 minutes of this webinar. So I'd encourage you to speak to a Equilar representative, or you can email me, and I'll be happy to explain to you the process. But essentially, what it does is it starts with a company peers, but there's things in place that allow it so that if a company is benchmarking to firms that don't benchmark to them, that are unique and might be outliers, that those are unlikely to show up. It uses essentially a network algorithm. Not going to get into the details here, but nonetheless something that worth discussing with an Equilar representative, that we can explain how the process goes and exactly how that fits in. The other thing I'd like to go back for some clarification on is I quickly glossed over realizable and realized pay and the difference between that and the summary compensation table. The big differences between those is how equity is valued. in realizable pay, what it does is it takes an option award that is granted during the year, and instead of valuing it using the Black-Scholes model, what it does is it takes the intrinsic value. So if the stock price is at $10 when the award is granted, and that's what the exercise price is, and at the end of the year the stock price is now $20, the value of that is the number of options times $10 because that's the increase. And that's the actual value of options. One of the criticisms around valuing options using Black-Scholes is essentially it's a guess. Now, of course, it's a very complicated guess, but nonetheless, it's a guess that, depending on how the stock price moves, can be accurate or can be certainly off the mark. And so this is something that shows how much an executive actually has. So if the stock price drops by quite a bit, it incorporates that feature and shows that the award isn't worth anything, even though there might have been a grant date value saying it was worth X amount of dollars. Realized pay uses, again, the value of options exercised and the value of stock awards that vested during the year. Those amounts can be found in the exercise and vesting table, usually found a few pages after the summary compensation table. But those are the three most popular ways to value equity and are being used. Again, for more information, it's a little bit more of a complicated topic than we want to spend the last 2 minutes discussing, but nonetheless are I think worth being educated about and understanding, because this is something that more and more companies are using, they're discussing. I know both ISS and Glass Lewis have discussed it as far as something that they may take into consideration and they may look at. Our Equilar's Pay for Performance tool allows companies to look at their number and helps them calculate that. So again, helping companies be able to identify and define pay as they want to. I think we're just about out of time. I apologize for anyone who I wasn't able to get to their question. Wendy, I would like to thank you for your time on today's webinar.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
Also, for everybody in attendance, if you could please fill out the survey on the screen, that would be most helpful to us in terms of assessing how we did and how we can improve in the future. For those who didn't get your question answered, we'll certainly try and reach out later. Again, the recording of this webinar will be made available afterwards, as well as you can access the slide deck and any of the reports that I mentioned in the resources section of today's webinar. So again, thank you all for taking the time to listen to us, and hopefully you got something out of it, and hopefully I will see all of you in 2 weeks. Thank you.